Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, November 13th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, another round of U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria. So things continue to escalate on this front. The Pentagon announced on Sunday night that it launched another round of airstrikes in eastern Syria, targeting facilities used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iran-affiliated groups, and that is referring to the Shia militias who operate in Iraq and Syria. So the strikes mark the third known round of U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria since U.S. troops in the region have come under a spate of attacks due to President Biden's support for Israel's assault on Gaza. So the Pentagon said on Saturday that U.S. bases have been targeted 48 times since October 17th, leaving 56 American troops injured. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said that the airstrikes launched on Sunday specifically targeted a training facility and a safe house near the cities of Abu Kamal and Mayadin, which are both located in eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor province. So the last round of U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria took place on November 8th, and before that was on October 27th. And if you remember, the U.S. said that these attacks were designed to deter these airstrikes were designed to deter further rocket and drone attacks on U.S. bases. Well, that clearly hasn't worked, and U.S. officials have acknowledged that the deterrence strategy has failed. And I just saw some unconfirmed reports on Twitter of more attacks on U.S. bases in Syria, right after these airstrikes. So things are really escalating here, and I think it's unfortunately only a matter of time before American troops start sustaining some serious casualties or an American troop could be killed. And an umbrella group known as the Islamic Resistance of Iraq has taken credit for most of these attacks. And we've had certain militia leaders come out and put out statements basically saying that these attacks are not going to stop until the war in Gaza stops, until there's a ceasefire. So it's all about that. It's all about U.S. supporting Israel. And, the U.S. should not be in Syria and Iraq in the first place. The smart thing to do would be to just bring the troops home instead of escalate the situation, which is what the U.S. is doing here, while claiming they don't want escalation. But it's very clear that these airstrikes are just going to keep provoking more attacks. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. thinks that Israel is trying to provoke a war in Lebanon. So this is interesting. Axios reported on Sunday that some members of the Biden administration are concerned that Israel is looking to provoke Hezbollah as a pretext for a wider war in Lebanon that could draw in the United States. So since the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, Hezbollah and Israel have been fighting across the Lebanon-Israel border. And this fighting has gotten pretty intense. It's mostly airstrikes and rocket fire. But the fighting has killed over 60 Hezbollah fighters. So that's a significant amount. That's a significant number. And also several civilians. There was the November 5th Israeli airstrike that killed a woman and 3 children who were in their car. And on the Israeli side, about 10 soldiers have been killed. I believe maybe a civilian or 2 as well. But it's pretty substantial casualties for something that is kind of being portrayed as not a war yet. So the U.S. is apparently concerned that this could escalate. And this Axios report said that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin expressed concern about the fighting on the border in a Saturday call with his Israeli counterpart, Yoav Gallant, and the White House requested Austin to relay the message due to growing anxiety that Israel's military action is exacerbating tensions on the border. So what's interesting about this report is that the U.S. isn't just saying that they're concerned and that they want to try de-escalation. It seems like they're putting the blame for the situation, for the escalations, on Israel. So the Pentagon had a readout of the call and said that Austin emphasized the need to contain the conflict to Gaza and avoid regional escalation. It did not specifically mention Lebanon. Sources told Axios that Austin asked for clarification about Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon and asked what steps would be taken to avoid a regional war. So while expressing concern about escalation, we have to keep in mind that the U.S. has emboldened Israel to be aggressive against Hezbollah by deploying all this firepower. You know, the 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, the additional air defenses, the submarine, all sorts of American firepower has been sent to the region in the name of protecting Israel, in the name of deterring people like groups like Hezbollah and Iran from, intervening in this war. So, of course, that has, again, emboldened Israel. That's what the U.S. is doing here, not just that support, but also sending them, according to the Pentagon, weapon shipments on a near daily basis. So, the U.S. acts like it's some bystander here, but they're very much a party to this conflict. And the U.S. also intervened directly in one instance when they intercepted those missiles and drones that were fired from Yemen by the Houthis. So they're actively protecting Israel. So the U.S. has also issued warnings to Hezbollah, and the implied threat is that if this thing turns into a full-blown war, that the U.S. could intervene directly against Hezbollah. And there was Michael McCaul, he's the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He said a few weeks ago that he was drawing up a bill, basically an authorization for the use of military force against Hezbollah and Hamas and possibly Iran if this thing escalates into a regional war. So some elements of the U.S. government are preparing for this thing to really escalate. So again, it's just interesting kind of to see the way that report was framed, and that it was an Axios report citing U.S. and Israeli sources. And that reporter for Axios that they have covering Israel is pretty good. Barak Ravid, I believe his name is. I generally trust the stuff that he reports. All right, so the next one here, 5 U.S. soldiers deployed to the Middle East killed while training. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And so a group of special operations soldiers died during training operations off the coast of Cyprus when their helicopter crashed on Saturday. So this first broke, I believe it was Sunday, and it wasn't clear what the situation was, what these troops were doing. But it turns out more information came out that they were part of these deployments. So these troops that were in this helicopter that crashed and were killed, wouldn't have been in the region if not for the U.S. supporting this Israel's war in Gaza. So the New York Times reports U.S. officials say the White House has sent several teams of special operators to the region in the wake of increased tensions caused by the brutal Israeli military operation in Gaza. The New York Times report says that the Pentagon has quietly dispatched to Cyprus commando teams from the Joint Special Operations Command, including the Army's Delta Force and the Navy SEALs and the Navy's SEAL Team 6 to stand by in case they are needed to help evacuate Americans from the region. The outlet noted that the soldiers were training in hostage rescue operations. Some Americans remain held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. So this was... Apparently, these guys were on standby in case they were going to go into Gaza. We know there's U.S. special operators in Israel. They say that they're not going into Gaza and it's not a combat role, but who really knows? I wouldn't be surprised if we learned that there is American special forces, special operations forces on the ground in Gaza. We know that U.S. American drones are flying over Gaza. So again, it's just these guys were killed on this deployment for Israel's war. All right, so the next one here, Jake Sullivan will not judge if Israel is following the rules of war. So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Sunday that Israel should follow the rules of war in Gaza, but would not say if he believed the Israeli military is doing so. So this was really something. And Sullivan made these comments on CNN's State of the Union when he was asked if Israel needed to do more to limit civilian casualties. So Sullivan said that Israel has a responsibility, quote, to operate according to the rules of war, and we have continued to make that point both publicly and privately, and we will continue to do so as we go forward, end quote. So he's asked about the civilian casualties, says Israel must follow the rules of war, but then he is asked if they are following the rules of war and says he's not going to judge Israel. His response to the question was, quote, "I'm not going to sit here and play judge or jury on that question," end quote. So I think it's just a really good kind of encapsulation of the attitude of the Biden administration, of the U.S. when it comes to what's going on in Gaza. We're seeing this mass slaughter of civilians and children, and they're saying, hey, that's not good, but they're not really doing anything to stop it. They're supporting it 100%. And even when asked questions like this, do you think they're following the rules of war? And what are the rules of war? What rules is the U.S. going by? The U.S. doesn't apply international law if it doesn't suit its interests. So, but just that reply, again, just a good encapsulation, I think, of the attitude. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu says that only the Israeli military can control Gaza. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said several times in recent days that the Israeli Defense Forces is the only force that can control Gaza after the war, signaling plans for a long-term military occupation. So he made some comments on Friday at a meeting with Israeli mayors. He said, quote, "IDF forces will remain in control of the Strip. We will not give it to international forces," end quote. If you remember, there were reports that said the U.S. and Israel was considering some sort of multinational force in Gaza. So we've seen the Biden administration officials say that they don't want Israel to reoccupy Gaza, but the U.S. has not placed any conditions on its support for Israel's campaign. I've said, a lot that what we're seeing from Blinken and Biden saying, oh, we need a two-state solution after this. It's just not a realistic. It just doesn't really matter. It's empty rhetoric because realistically, they're not going to put any pressure on Netanyahu, and it's very clear what Netanyahu wants. So one clarification to make. So, they say that they don't want Israel to reoccupy Gaza, but the fact is, Israel occupied Gaza from 1967 onwards, and in 2005, they withdrew their troops, but then in 2007, they put a blockade on Gaza, which is technically considered a military occupation, and they control everything that goes in and out of Gaza with the exception of the Rafah border crossing into Egypt. Control their they bomb fishing boats if they go too far off the coast. They control they restrict construction materials from going into Gaza, so many people can't rebuild their homes after airstrikes, and we're talking about previous conflicts or previous flare-ups. So anyway, Netanyahu reaffirmed these comments that he made on Sunday, and he rejected the idea of the Palestinian Authority taking over Gaza. And the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, they administer some parts of the West Bank. So Netanyahu told NBC's Meet the Press, quote, "We need to see the following two things. Gaza has to be demilitarized and Gaza has to be de-radicalized. And I think so far we haven't seen any Palestinian force, including the Palestinian Authority, that is able to do that," end quote. So I had to mention here some, what I think is important context, and I linked to this great article that Scott Horton and Connor Freeman wrote titled "Netanyahu's Support for Hamas Has Backfired." They published it about 2 weeks ago, but they actually updated it the other day with just some more quotes. And it's really about this strategy that Netanyahu and other Israeli officials have had. They don't want a Palestinian state, within the West Bank and Gaza. So they've kind of capitalized on the split between the different Palestinian factions, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And, the big quote from Netanyahu, this is from a 2019 meeting, Likud party meeting, and it just illuminates his strategy when it comes to Hamas, keeping them separate from the PA in the West Bank. Netanyahu said, quote, "Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank," end quote. And then this other quote here is from Bezalel Smotrich, who is the leader of Israel's religious Zionist party. He's considered a radical and extremist. but he's actually in the Netanyahu government now. He's part of the coalition. He is the finance minister, and he has a lot of control over settlements in the West Bank as well. But this is something he said in 2015. He said, quote, "The PA is a liability and Hamas is an asset. On the international playing field in this game of delegitimization, think about it for a second. The PA is a liability and Hamas is an asset. It's a terrorist organization. Nobody will recognize it. Nobody will give it status at the ICC, and nobody will let them push resolutions at the UN, causing us to need an American veto," end quote. So it's interesting what he said there about the UN, because the US always generally vetoes stuff for Israel. But yeah, I mean, that's just shows what their thinking is that since Hamas isn't going to be recognized internationally, they benefit from them being in charge in Gaza. They didn't think that they were a real threat. And that's one of the reasons why so many people in Israel are mad at Netanyahu and want him out. Well, that's what the polling is showing. That a lot of people in Israel are blaming Netanyahu for the attack. And it's not some conspiracy that Israel created Hamas. It's a fact that they, tried to use Hamas to their advantage. All right, so the next one here. Israeli president claims that Mein Kampf was found in a Gaza's child's room. So this is some pretty ridiculous propaganda here. Israeli President Isaac Herzog claimed in an interview with BBC on Sunday that Israeli forces found a copy of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf in a child's bedroom in northern Gaza. And this is really Herzog's latest attempt to justify the mass killing of Palestinian civilians that's going on. So he claimed that the child's bedroom was turned into a terrorist base and that the book was found on the body of a Hamas fighter. He said, quote, "The terrorist wrote notes, marked the sections, and studied again and again the ideology of Adolf Hitler, to hate the Jews, to kill the Jews, to burn and slaughter Jews wherever they are," end quote. So it's really something that he's saying here, that they found a dead Hamas guy with a copy of Adolf Hitler's book in a child's bedroom in Gaza. What's the implication there? Oh, we got to bomb kids in, child's bedrooms. And he's previously, presented some sketchy evidence. Recently, he was showing a document that he claimed was an Al-Qaeda manual that showed how to make chemical weapons. But it turns out he was displaying the cover of an amateur biography of Ramzi Youssef, who's one of the perpetrators of the World Trade Center bombing. And it contained no directions on making chemical weapons, according to a copy of the book. So keep that in mind. And so when he held up that Al-Qaeda thing, he said, we're dealing with Al-Qaeda, we're dealing with ISIS, Hamas, they're all the same. And that's part of this propaganda effort to point to the U.S. War against ISIS from 2014 to, the heaviest was up to 2017, 2018, when they were bombing them in Mosul and in Raqqa, Syria. The U.S., they did a ton of airstrikes and they killed thousands and thousands of civilians. I believe in Mosul it was around 10,000 civilians. So they're pointing at that and saying, but that was over 9 months. That what's happening in Gaza has just been over a month. But anyway, pointing to that and saying, see, you guys killed a lot of civilians when you fought ISIS, and also going back to World War II and the firebombing of Tokyo, the bombing of Dresden, dropping the atomic bombs on Japan. That's all part of the propaganda. And Herzog also previously argued that there were no innocent civilians in Gaza. He said, quote, "It is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true," end quote. Oh, so I put the latest death toll from Gaza's health ministry in there that I wanted to mention. So they say more than 11,000 Palestinians have been killed, including over 4,500 children. And over the weekend, there's been a lot of attacks on hospitals. There's a lot of fighting around the Al-Shifa hospital, which is where the Gazan health ministry official who reports all this stuff is based. And there's about a day or two where nobody heard, he didn't put out any updated numbers because they're losing communications to all the other hospitals, because the way they're counting it is hospitals and morgues are reporting to him the people that are killed and the bodies that they have. And it's getting harder and harder for those communications to continue. So the next one here, Israeli Minister Avi Dichter says that Nakba is being rolled out in Gaza. So this is another Israeli minister saying some very inflammatory things here about the situation in Gaza. So an Israeli minister said on Saturday that Tel Aviv was rolling out a Nakba in the Gaza Strip, as more than 1.5 million people have been left displaced by Israel's relentless bombardment of the Palestinian territory. So in an interview on Saturday with the Israeli N12 channel, Agriculture Minister Avi Dichter was asked about whether the dispossession of Gaza's residents was the long-term or temporary objective of Israel's military campaign. He said, quote, "It is first and almost an operational event. We have a huge number of fighters of our own that have to operate in a densely populated area. We need to reduce the number of residents. This is going to result in some sort of Nakba. This is a Gaza Nakba 2023. That's how it will end," end quote. And he's using the term Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. And that refers to the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948, when about 750 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the territory. Thousands more were killed. So that's what he's talking about. And, we know from that leaked Israeli intelligence ministry document that is ultimately what the Netanyahu government, at least we know that they're considering it. They want to push all the Palestinians out of Gaza. All right, so the next one here, this is really, there's some horrific stuff in here. Gaza patients face inevitable death amid hospital sieges. So I mentioned that, there's attacks it was tough. I mean, it was hard for me to keep track of all the attacks on hospitals that happened over the weekend. That's how bad that it has been for, people in these hospitals. And if you see this picture here, it's showing a group of newborn babies that were taken off incubators in the Al-Shifa hospital because there was a power outage. And I know they were saying 39 premature babies were at risk of dying, and at least 2 have died so far. So again, just really horrific. So this article is from Middle East Eye. I'll just read a little bit of it. Thousands of people remain trapped at Gaza's largest hospital, Al-Shifa, on Sunday, as Israeli forces continue to besiege and bombard the facility for the third day in a row, while a nearby hospital announced it was out of service due to the lack of fuel. As of Sunday evening, 22 hospitals and 49 medical centers have completely stopped working in Gaza due to Israeli bombing and the severance of all fuel and electricity in the Strip since October 9th, a Palestinian government spokesperson said in a press conference. He added that Israeli bombings have also ignited a fire in one of the wards of the hospital while an oxygen tank was destroyed. Gaza's government media office also stated that Israeli forces have fully destroyed 7 mosques and 3 churches, while 153 mosques have been partially destroyed in bombings. And there was reports of Israeli snipers shooting people at the hospital, the Al-Shifa hospital, and they're claiming there's a underground Hamas compound under the hospital, and they're using that claim as an excuse to basically lay siege to this hospital. There's reports of pregnant women having to have C-sections without any sort of anesthetic. I mean, just horrific things that I just can't imagine living through. And this is what Biden is supporting. This is what, the U.S. is supporting here. It's this horrific. All right, so the next one here, the UN mourns record death toll of 150 employees killed in Gaza. So this is just another indication of the amount of people that are being killed. More than 100 United Nations employees have been killed in Israel's war on Gaza, the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency said on Friday, making it the deadliest conflict ever for the UN in such a short period of time. Some were killed waiting for bread. Others died along with their families in their homes. And again, just over 100 killed in 1 month of these UN employees. They said the number is 101 right now. All right, so the next one here, diplomats support for Israel. Diplomats say that support for Israel is destroying the U.S. image in the Middle East. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone, and it says that CNN reports that American diplomats in the Middle East sent a diplomatic cable to the White House, raising the alarm that the Israeli military operations in Gaza are causing severe damage to the U.S. reputation in the region. Washington is Tel Aviv's most dedicated backer, sending billions of dollars in weapons to Israel every year. CNN says it obtained the cable authored by a diplomat stationed in Oman. It says what Israel's doing to Gaza is, quote, losing us Arab publics for a generation, end quote. The outlet reports that the diplomat says robust U.S. support for Israel's actions is being seen as material and moral culpability in what they consider to be possible war crimes. Saying that the U.S. is losing badly on the messaging battle space. And I think that seems to be, again, this conflict is just much different than previous ones, probably just because of the scale of it. In the West, in the U.S., it seems to be different. There's a lot more room for criticism of Israel than there used to be. So they're talking about in the Middle East, in the Arab world. So I can only imagine how bad the U.S. and Israel are losing the messaging battle space there. All right, so getting out of the Gaza stuff. I know I've been trying to keep track of Ukraine and other conflicts going on in the world. It's been kind of tough, but this next one here is about the Nord Stream bombing, and it's a report from the Washington Post that claims a senior Ukrainian military officer directed the sabotage attacks on the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines that connect Russia and Germany, and they blew up on September 26, 2022. So this Washington Post report cited anonymous sources who claimed Colonel Roman Chervinsky, who is currently in jail on an unrelated case, was the coordinator of the attack. The report said that he managed logistics and support for a 6-person team that rented a sailboat under false identities and used deep-sea diving equipment to place explosive charges on the gas pipeline. So for his part, Chervinsky has denied the allegations. He said, quote, all speculation about my involvement in the attack on Nord Stream are being spread by Russian propaganda without any basis, end quote. So this Washington Post report did not mention Seymour Hersh's report on the Nord Stream bombings, which allege that the operation was actually ordered by President Biden and carried out by U.S. Navy divers and coordinated with Norway. So while Hersh's report has not yet hasn't been confirmed by another source, we do know that the U.S. had the clear motive to bomb the Nord Stream pipelines. For years, the U.S. was trying to stop Nord Stream 2 with sanctions. President Biden actually vowed to bring an end to Nord Stream 2. This was before Russia invaded Ukraine. He said, if they invade, we will bring an end to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Victoria Nuland said something very similar. And then after the pipeline was bombed, Secretary of State Antony Blinken described the incident as a tremendous opportunity to get Europe off Russian natural gas, so they could buy more American natural gas. So again, the motive is there. And this report is saying that Chervinsky did not plan the Nord Stream bombings and that he took orders from senior officials who ultimately reported to Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny. So the anonymous sources told the Post that Zelensky was purposely kept out of the loop. So this story, Zelensky is not implicated in this version. The question is this Chervinsky guy the fall guy that they decided to pin this on? He's already in jail, and he is, he's in jail over kind of a strange thing. Apparently, he was involved in some plot to get a Russian pilot to defect to Ukraine. Ukrainian authorities claim that he was not working under orders and that this plot ended up with Russia gaining coordinates to a Ukrainian airfield, and it led to a Russian strike that killed one Ukrainian soldier and wounded 17 more. So that's why he's in jail. He denies it and says that he was working under orders to recruit the Russian pilot, and he denies responsibility for the strike on the airfield. So that's the question. Is this guy just a fall guy? But it also is really kind of amazing that now the kind of official story, I guess it's not the official story, because it's not coming from the U.S. government directly, but the story being reported by the Washington Post and other mainstream outlets is that it was Ukraine that blew up the pipeline. And if you remember, in the immediate aftermath, you had all these media outlets and Western government officials saying it was Russia, even though it made no sense for Russia to blow up their own pipeline. So now the official story points the finger at Ukraine. This is also kind of a convenient time as the support for the proxy war seems to be winding down. So we'll see, how this all plays out. All right, so the last story here, President Biden is meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and that is going to happen this Wednesday in San Francisco at this APEC summit. And this comes, of course, amid very high tensions, and this report from the South China Morning Post says that contentious issues are on the table. So they're going to be discussing the need for military-to-military dialogue. Apparently the White House said it's going to be contentious talks. And, as I always point out, because I think it's important to point out, the U.S. kind of frames these talks that they've been having with Chinese officials as a way to manage the competition and not really a way to resolve issues. They just want to keep going the course they're going with China with this military buildup, right near China and all this new support for Taiwan. But try to act like they're doing it responsibly. So we'll see if anything comes of this or if it's just going to be more like talk for the sake of talking. But I still think we should always encourage talks, diplomacy. It's always good to see. But that is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Doug Bandow, Orwell's 1984 in Washington, one from Sheldon Richman, When History Did Not Begin, one from Ramsey Baroud, The West is Collectively Responsible for Israel's Genocide in Gaza, one from Judge Knapp, Unconstitutional Killings, and one from Aaron Mate, Biden's Personal Attachments to Israel Fuels Its Massacre in Gaza. And what he's talking about there is the Washington Post report that said the U.S. is not using any of its leverage it has over Israel, in part due to President Biden's personal attachment to Israel. So please go check all that out. And if you scroll down again, I went through hundreds and hundreds of articles today that were built up over the weekend. There's just tons of stuff on Gaza, and there's definitely things I have neglected to cover that maybe I should have, just because there's just so much stuff. But you could just take a little scroll through and see if any headlines pop out at you at the bottom of the page there. But that's everything. You could always support this show just by sharing it, telling your friends about antiwar.com, subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, leave reviews, leave comments. I appreciate everybody that comments. Follow us on Twitter. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.